The suitcase was open on the floor, half filled with clothes that belonged to another life. A guidebook to Italy sat on the counter with a napkin marking a page about a coastal town where the mornings were slow, the sea air salt sweet, and the coffee strong enough to make you forget you were ever tired. That was supposed to be my destination. 5 days, my first real vacation in years. I had folded linen dresses with almost ceremonial care, as if fabric could promise me a softer version of myself. My phone lit up, a new message. The sender was the chief executive. The subject line was only one word, urgent. I should have felt my chest tighten. Instead, the old reflexes woke up like muscle memory. I wiped coffee from my thumb and opened the message. The words bent the room. A deal in Singapore was falling apart. $40 million at risk. The client had raised questions no one on the team could answer. Could I be there in 48 hours? There was no please. There never was. I looked at the suitcase and at the little white dress lying on top like an idea too fragile for the world I lived in. I closed my eyes, let the hum of the refrigerator wash through me, and waited for the weight of disappointment to pass. When I opened my eyes again, I knew what I would do. I folded the dress carefully, laid it on the chair by the door, and reached for a different suitcase. I typed a one-sentence reply. I will handle it. The rest of the morning broke into tasks the way my mind always does when the stakes are sharp. I canceled my flight, shifted my calendar, and opened the folders on my desk. 3 of them went into the new suitcase. One was full of data protection matrices. Another held copies of our last major compliance review. The third was a binder dated 2 years ago that still gave me a prickle every time I touched it. By noon, I was at the office, because everything always went faster when I worked from my own archive. The elevator hummed as it rose, and when the doors slid open, the executive floor stretched before me in polished silence. The receptionist gave me a look that carried both sympathy and relief. I nodded back. Inside the corner office, the chief executive smiled the way people smile when they are frightened and grateful in equal measure. Beside him stood Lucas Turner, the deputy head of sales, all sharp suit and brighter watch. He didn't hide the annoyance in his face. He didn't have to. I was the one they called when promises became traps. I set my bag down and asked for the short version. The client was a major telecommunications group spread across Southeast Asia. Their legal counsel had raised concerns about cross-border data transfers, lawful access requests, and the promises our sales team had already put on paper. Promises that looked clean when spoken fast in a meeting but collapsed under legal light. The client had paused everything. Unless they received airtight compliance guarantees, the deal was gone. I nodded once. The map of risks built itself in my head without effort. I asked to see the draft terms. Lucas slid a printout across the table with a smile too soft to be sincere. I read the first page, then the second. I felt my stomach turn. The paper was full of reckless language. Some promises were survivable. One was impossible. I lifted my eyes. Who wrote these clauses? The silence in the room gave me the answer before anyone spoke. Lucas cleared his throat. The client had pushed hard, he said. The team had flexed to keep momentum. I kept my voice calm. I told them we would need to rewrite the data residency clause to give a choice of geography. We would restructure the language on lawful access. We would create an appendix listing subprocessors by category, not by brand. I told them that unless I carried these corrections myself, the deal would not survive. The chief executive agreed instantly. Lucas smiled again, but his eyes said something colder. The rest of the meeting dissolved into logistics. Flights, hotels, access requests, conference rooms with a view of the water. By the time I left, the receptionist handed me a travel packet with every detail except rest. That night, the suitcase was heavier than the one I had packed for Italy. Fewer dresses. More black suits. I told myself I would sleep on the plane. The flight left at midnight. Cabin lights low, the air thick with the hum of tired travelers. I closed my eyes for the first hour, counting breaths like beads, but rest refused. I opened my laptop. The screen lit the dark like a secret. I built frameworks. I turned clauses into joints that could carry weight. I wrote questions for the client counsel, knowing how I would ask them, steady and without apology. Dawn came slow over the wing, pale gold against black sky. I closed the laptop and stared at the horizon. A man in the row ahead whispered a prayer. I thought of the guidebook in my kitchen drawer, the Italian sun I wouldn't see, and the dress folded back into its box. I reminded myself that this was temporary, only what I was good at. But the thought lingered longer than I wanted it to. Singapore rose out of the morning like a city polished for display. The air was warm and thick. A driver waited with my name on a sign. At the hotel, I checked in, showered, and dressed in a dark suit that made me feel like a boundary line. Hair tied back, a small silver pendant at my throat. My mother had given it to me once for luck. I did not believe in luck, but I wore it anyway. The conference room was on the top floor of a tower that seemed built to admire itself. Glass on every side, the city stretched like a painting. The client team was polite but cold. Their counsel was a woman close to my age, with eyes that measured every word. She had seen contracts collapse before and had no intention of seeing it again. We began. I kept my introduction short. I told them I was here to reduce their risk and to earn their trust. Then I opened my binder and we started line by line. They asked how our platform isolated data by region. I showed them the controls. They asked about lawful requests from governments. I explained our thresholds for resistance. They asked about subprocessors and audits. I showed them policy and precedent. I told the truth and nothing more. Lucas sat against the wall, watching the clock like it was his last ally. Twice, I reached a line I would not bend. I looked the counsel in the eye and said no, not with anger, with certainty. Slowly, the paper began to change shape, from fragile promises into terms that might last. By evening, we were close. The client asked for a pause to let their board review. In the corridor, Lucas leaned on the glass and whistled softly. "You have a gift," he said, "for making the impossible sound inevitable." I told him I had a gift for not lying. He laughed like it was a joke. My phone buzzed, a reminder. The flight to Rome I was not on had just departed. I flipped the screen down. When the client returned, they had 3 items circled. 2 were simple. 1 was difficult. I asked for 10 minutes. I stepped into a side room and called our infrastructure lead. He answered in the voice of someone who lives inside emergencies. We talked architecture. We found a way. It would take sweat but not blood. I returned with words written clear. The counsel read them. Her expression softened. At 6, we finished. We shook hands. They would take it to their board. I gathered my papers. Lucas clapped too hard on my shoulder. "The team triumphed together," he said. I smiled because I had no energy left to argue. Back at the hotel, I sat on the floor with my back against the bed. The air smelled like soap and new carpet. I sent a summary to the chief executive and the general counsel. I did not copy HR. Instinct is another kind of study. I set an alarm for dawn. I closed my eyes and dreamed in bullet points. Morning arrived like a sharp knock on the door of my mind. I woke before the alarm, heart already moving as if it had been running all night. I dressed quickly and walked to the tower that had become both battlefield and cage. The elevator opened to the high floor, the glass walls gleaming as if they enjoyed watching people falter inside them. The client counsel was already there, reviewing her notes. She greeted me with a nod that carried weight. Respect, maybe, or simply acknowledgement that I had survived the first round. The rest of the client team filed in, measured, professional, wary. They knew the game. They had played it with others. Today they would play it with me. We focused on the 3 clauses they had circled. 2 we settled with quiet precision. The 3rd was the monster. A promise the sales team had written in their eagerness, one that was impossible to deliver without breaking law or bending physics. I wrote the sentence once, crossed it out. Wrote it again, felt the room tighten, then pushed the page across the table. The counsel read slowly. When she lifted her eyes, there was the faintest flicker of approval. She said that would work. The meeting ended with formalities, but there was something heavier beneath them. The client's board would meet later that day. If they accepted the revised terms, signatures would follow. If not, everything would collapse. I had done my part. Now we would wait. I stepped outside into a city that seemed designed to remind you how small you are. Towers stretching, streets buzzing, light glinting off water that never stopped moving. For a few minutes, I let myself simply walk. I bought a coffee from a stall where the man behind the counter smiled without asking questions. I drank it standing, watching people hurry by, each face carrying stories I would never know. For one moment, I let myself imagine I belonged to a life where mornings began like this instead of inside conference rooms. By afternoon, the board had met. The client's counsel called me directly. Her voice was clear and steady. They would proceed. I thanked her, closed my laptop, and sat back in the chair. 40 million secured. The deal had survived the storm. For the first time in days, I let out a breath that felt like release. Later, in the glass tower, we signed. No speeches, no champagne, only the sound of pens scratching across paper. I looked at the words I had written, the clauses I had shaped, and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing they would stand. Lucas clapped me on the back too hard and told the room that success was always a team effort. I smiled thinly. He had no idea what I was carrying. That night in the hotel room, I called the chief executive. He answered on the second ring. His voice was lighter than I had heard in months. He thanked me. He said the board was relieved. He said we could all breathe again. I listened and nodded, though he could not see me. When we hung up, I sat in the silence and stared at the ceiling. I thought of the guidebook to Italy still waiting at home, the little dress folded away. I reminded myself that some people travel for joy, others for survival. I belonged to the second group. The flight home was a blur of recycled air and restless legs. I barely closed my eyes. My mind kept running down lists of what had been promised, what needed to be implemented, what still lingered at the edges of risk. By the time we descended into New York, the sunrise had turned the sky into a sheet of pale fire. I tightened my grip on the armrest and told myself I had carried the company safely again. Customs was fast, the car ride cold, the city alive in its usual unkind rhythm. I reached the office early, the building still shaking off sleep. My badge beeped at the glass doors. I rode the elevator up, carrying the exhaustion like an extra coat. My calendar buzzed a reminder: meeting with human resources. I had accepted the invite without thought in Singapore. Now it glowed red on my screen like a warning light. When I walked down the hall, I saw the room they had chosen. A conference room with glass walls set in the main corridor so every passerby would see. A stage dressed as an office. Inside were 3 people waiting: the head of HR with her careful smile, a lawyer from our legal team shifting papers with nervous fingers, and Lucas, polished as ever, a trace of triumph tucked behind his eyes. I sat at the table, my hands folded, my breathing steady. The head of HR opened a folder and began to read. She spoke words that were familiar in their shape but absurd in their intent: unauthorized absence, breach of procedure, disruption of operations. Each phrase delivered with practiced neutrality, as if she believed the performance of fairness could erase the substance of betrayal. I listened. I did not interrupt. I looked through the glass at people walking past, pretending not to notice, though their eyes flicked toward the room. I let the silence grow after the reading ended. The HR lead slid the paper toward me, a disciplinary notice. A document designed not to punish but to build a path toward termination. Sign it and they would have what they needed later. I read it once. I read it again. The trap was so neat it almost made me laugh. Lucas smirked, certain the game was his. The lawyer kept his head down. The HR lead folded her hands, waiting. I lifted my eyes and asked one simple question. "Do you have the travel authorization signed by the chief executive?" Her face tightened. She said this was not about debating documentation. This was about procedures. I nodded slowly, as if learning something new. Then I picked up the pen. I signed my name, steady and clear. I dated it. I capped the pen and slid it back into my pocket. Lucas's smirk widened. He thought I had surrendered. The HR lead exhaled like the weight of process had settled into place. I gathered the papers into my bag. I stood. I thanked them with a calm voice. I said I would send them everything they had requested, and also everything they had forgotten to request. Then I left. Outside the glass, people pretended not to look, but I could feel their eyes. I walked down the corridor with even steps, carrying the weight of what they thought was my defeat. But I knew better. That signature was not surrender. It was evidence. A thread in a tapestry I had been weaving for years. My office was at the end of the forgotten hallway, beside the archive room no one else visited. The plant on my desk still fought to live without light. The folders were stacked high, towers of paper that had carried the company through storms no one else noticed. I closed the door behind me, locked it, and set my bag down. I opened the cabinet that required a key only I possessed. Inside were 5 years of careful records, emails printed and filed, contracts annotated in the margins, notes of meetings where promises had been made that could never stand, all of it sorted, cataloged, and waiting. I powered on my laptop. The screen glowed in the dim room. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I felt no anger, no panic, only the calm that comes when the truth finally finds its hour. They thought they had trapped me with procedures. They did not understand that procedures were my language, my strength, my weapon. I began to type. The first morning back in New York felt like stepping into a storm that pretended to be calm. The sky outside was clear, but inside the office the air seemed heavier, as if it already knew what was coming. I walked past familiar desks, nodded at colleagues who offered polite smiles, and slid into my office with the same quiet precision I always carried. The plant on my desk leaned toward the fluorescent light as though it believed in hope. I touched one of its leaves and almost envied its stubbornness. Then I opened my laptop. The screen glowed with the usual flood of emails. Most were routine. A few carried thanks for the Singapore deal, short notes from people who wanted to be on record without truly committing to gratitude. And then there was one message that made the rest blur into noise. The subject line, performance concerns. The sender, human resources. I clicked. The words unfolded like a knife wrapped in polite language. My absence from the office had been deemed unauthorized. My failure to follow proper procedures had disrupted operations. A formal review was scheduled. Attached was a document that read like an accusation designed to sound like fact. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. I thought of the signatures on the Singapore contract, still fresh, still binding, still carrying $40 million into our books. I thought of the chief executive's voice on the phone, light with relief. And then I thought of the HR lead's careful smile behind glass and of Lucas's smirk. I scrolled down to the CC line. There it was. Lucas Turner's name. He had forwarded concerns about my pattern of absence the same afternoon I was in Singapore closing the deal. He had timed it perfectly. While I was saving the company, he had been sharpening the blade. For a long moment, I let the silence of the office settle. Then I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out one of my notebooks. I wrote the date. I copied the subject line. I noted the phrasing of the accusation word for word. Documentation. It was instinct now. It was also survival. The day passed in a blur of small conversations and glances I pretended not to notice. In the break room, chatter fell silent when I walked in. At lunch, a few colleagues avoided my eyes. They had heard something. They always heard something. Rumors moved faster than facts. Lucas appeared at my door near 3 in the afternoon. He leaned against the frame with the relaxed posture of someone who believed he was in control. He congratulated me on the Singapore deal in a tone that stripped the words of meaning. Then he asked, casually, if I had seen the note from HR. I looked at him with the same expression I used in negotiations, the one that revealed nothing. I told him yes, I had seen it. He nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. He said processes were important, that even the best results could not excuse skipping steps. His watch glinted when he gestured with his hand. His smile was thin. When he left, I closed the door and let out a breath. My pen hovered over the notebook before moving again. I wrote his words down exactly. Processes are important. Results cannot excuse skipping steps. Later, those words would matter. For now, they joined the growing archive of shadows. That evening, alone in my apartment, I cooked pasta I barely tasted. The city outside the window pulsed with its usual rhythm, horns and sirens layered like an endless song. I sat at the table and thought of the guidebook to Italy still on the counter, waiting for a trip that would never come. I thought of how many times I had chosen the company over myself, and I thought of how easily they had turned my loyalty into a weapon. I opened my laptop and scrolled through old folders. Years of warnings, memos, unanswered emails. Each file was a reminder of how fragile the company truly was. Each one was also a reminder of why they feared me, because I kept receipts, because I remembered, because I did not forget the things they wanted buried. The next morning, the HR meeting appeared on my calendar again, this time with bold red letters. Mandatory. I walked into the building with calm steps, though my stomach twisted like rope. I knew the room they would choose. I knew the performance they would stage. Glass walls, visible humiliation, the theater of discipline. As I passed through the lobby, I noticed the way people looked at me. Some with pity, some with curiosity, a few with something like awe. They knew what was happening, or they thought they did. I pressed the elevator button and let the doors close me into silence. Upstairs, the glass room waited. I saw the papers neatly stacked on the table. I saw the faces rehearsed into masks. The HR lead, the company lawyer, and Lucas, always Lucas, as if he could not resist watching me fall. I stepped inside and sat. I folded my hands. I let them begin. The HR lead began with the kind of voice you use when reading instructions to a stranger. Calm, precise, stripped of humanity. She recited each accusation as though the words were facts carved into stone. Failure to follow procedure. Unauthorized absence. Disruption of essential duties. A pattern of disregard. Each phrase landed like a small hammer. The lawyer at her side shuffled the pages, adjusting them into perfect alignment as though that could make them true. Lucas sat across the table with his hands folded, the curve of his mouth threatening a smile he could not contain. He leaned back slightly, relaxed, as though he was watching a performance staged for his amusement. Every so often he glanced at me with the quiet confidence of someone who believed he had already won. I let them finish. I listened without interrupting. I watched the words collect in the air between us like smoke. When the HR lead finally slid the document toward me, I took it gently. The paper was warm from her hands. I read it line by line, carefully, as if it were a contract with a hidden trap. Which, of course, it was. The trap was elegant. By signing, I would acknowledge their claims. Not admit guilt, but give them the first stone to build the wall around me. Without my signature, they would paint me as uncooperative. With it, they would construct a narrative of repeated failure. Either way, they thought the outcome was theirs to shape. I raised my eyes. Do you have the travel authorization signed by the chief executive? My voice was even, my face calm. The HR lead blinked. She said this meeting was not about debating documentation. It was about procedures. I nodded slowly, as though I had learned something useful. Lucas exhaled, certain the end was near. His smirk widened, eyes bright with quiet triumph. The lawyer cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. The HR lead folded her hands and waited. I uncapped the pen. My hand did not shake. I signed my name with deliberate care, letter by letter, as though engraving it into memory. Then I added the date, precise and undeniable. When I capped the pen again, the silence in the room was heavy enough to touch. Lucas leaned forward, satisfaction radiating off him. The HR lead exhaled with relief. The lawyer gathered the pages with the eagerness of someone eager to file them away and be done. They believed I had surrendered. I stood. I placed the pen back in my pocket. I gathered the papers they had already handed over and slid them into my bag. I looked at each of them in turn. "Thank you," I said. "I will provide everything you have requested. And everything you have forgotten to request." Lucas's smirk faltered, just slightly, as though the words had caught him off guard. The HR lead shifted in her seat. The lawyer looked down. I opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. The glass walls framed me like a portrait for the entire floor to see. People passing by pretended not to look, but I could feel their eyes following me. Their silence carried both fear and curiosity. They believed they had witnessed my fall. I walked calmly, each step measured. The weight in my chest was not defeat. It was clarity. That signature was not submission. It was evidence. A piece of a larger design I had been building for years. Back in my office, the quiet was absolute. I closed the door and locked it. The plant on my desk stood in its usual defiance, reaching toward light that was never enough. I sat down, set my bag on the floor, and unlocked the cabinet beside me. The key turned with a soft click, and the doors opened to reveal the archive. Inside were years of careful documentation. Emails printed and filed by date. Contracts marked with notes in the margins. Memos ignored, warnings dismissed. A quiet library of everything they had tried to bury. I had built it patiently, piece by piece, because I always knew this day would come. I pulled out a file labeled with a date from 2 years ago. Inside was a thread of emails between Lucas and his team, promises made to clients that violated international law. I had flagged them at the time. I had written memos. The responses had been dismissive. "We will revisit this later." Later had never come. Until now. I opened another drawer, more evidence. A folder on misclassified contractors. A folder on unpaid overtime. A folder on regulatory violations brushed aside. Each one a reminder of how fragile the company was beneath its polished exterior. Each one a weapon, sharp and waiting. I powered on my laptop. The glow of the screen filled the room. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. There was no anger in me, no panic. Only a steady calm. They thought they had trapped me with their paperwork. They did not understand that paperwork was my language. It was the weapon I had perfected. The Singapore deal had proven one thing beyond doubt. I could hold the weight of a corporation in my hands and keep it standing. But if they chose to use the systems I had built against me, they would learn what happened when I turned those systems around. I opened a new document. The title was simple. Compliance Violations Report. The cursor blinked, patient, steady, waiting. I began to type. The morning of the hearing felt like walking into the center of a stage I had never asked to stand on. My name sat on the calendar like a scarlet mark. Disciplinary review mandatory. The time was set, the place was chosen, and the outcome had already been written by the people who believed they held the pen. I walked into the building earlier than usual. The lobby lights reflected off marble floors, cold and unwelcoming. The receptionist smiled politely, though her eyes flicked down to the schedule in front of her, then back up at me. She knew where I was going. Everyone knew. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor. I heard voices drifting from the glass conference room before I even reached it. Laughter, low and brief, the kind of laughter people use when they want to remind themselves they are safe, even as they prepare to wound someone else. Through the glass I saw them. the HR lead in her crisp suit, posture straight and practiced, the corporate lawyer already flipping through papers with nervous precision, and Lucas, leaning back in his chair, casual confidence radiating from him like a perfume. He saw me approach and straightened just enough to make it look like courtesy. His smile was waiting for me. The room was designed to humiliate. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the corridor outside busy with foot traffic. Every passerby would see me inside, seated under judgment, my future dissected in plain view. It was not an accident. It was theater. I stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. I sat in the chair they had left open at the far end of the table. My back was to the glass. Their faces reflected faintly behind me. The HR lead welcomed me with words so polished they could have been scripted. "Thank you for joining us. We appreciate your cooperation." I folded my hands in front of me and listened. The HR lead began to read. Each accusation was delivered in that same steady tone, as though the weight of her voice alone could make it truth. Unauthorized absence from the office. Failure to follow proper procedure in requesting leave. Disruption of ongoing compliance operations. A pattern of disregard for company policy. Each statement stacked carefully atop the other, a tower of words meant to topple onto me. The lawyer chimed in only to confirm a date or a phrasing, eyes never meeting mine. Lucas, though, watched me the entire time. His smile grew with each sentence. He was enjoying himself, savoring the moment. He believed he had orchestrated my downfall perfectly. I let them finish. I did not interrupt. I sat in silence, the way I had sat through hundreds of tense negotiations, letting them believe I was powerless while I waited for the right moment. When the HR lead finally slid the document across the table, I reached out slowly and took it. The paper was thick, expensive stock, as though the company believed quality stationery could disguise a rotten core. My name was typed neatly at the top, the accusations listed below. At the bottom was a line waiting for my signature. I read it once. I read it again. I could see the trap as clearly as if they had highlighted it in red. Without my signature, they would accuse me of insubordination. With it, they would begin building their case to terminate me. Either way, they thought the game was theirs to win. Lucas leaned forward slightly, eager, his eyes bright with triumph. The HR lead folded her hands, waiting. The lawyer adjusted his tie. I raised my eyes and spoke in a calm voice. "Do you have a copy of the travel authorization signed by the chief executive?" The HR lead blinked, startled for only a second before regaining her composure. "This meeting is not about debating documentation," she replied smoothly. "It is about procedures." I nodded slowly as though considering her answer carefully. My hand moved to the pen resting on the table. The silence stretched. Lucas's smirk widened, certain he was watching me collapse. The HR lead's shoulders eased, convinced the process had worked. The lawyer looked relieved to be nearing the end. I picked up the pen. The air seemed to tighten around me. I signed my name in slow, deliberate strokes. Each letter was careful, etched into the paper with intent. I dated it. I capped the pen and set it down. The HR lead exhaled, her relief visible. The lawyer gathered the papers quickly, eager to complete the ritual. Lucas leaned back in his chair with a look of unmasked satisfaction, the smirk blooming into a smile that felt like victory. But inside me there was no defeat, only calm. The signature was not surrender. It was evidence, a record. A new thread in the tapestry I had been weaving for years. They thought I had given them what they needed. In truth, I had given myself exactly what I wanted. I stood, gathering my bag with quiet precision. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "I will provide everything you have requested, and everything you have forgotten to request." For the first time, Lucas's smile flickered. The HR lead frowned, uncertain. The lawyer froze, caught between protocol and confusion. I walked out of the glass room into the corridor, the eyes of coworkers brushing against me like invisible hands. Some pitied me, some were curious. A few, the sharp ones, looked at me with something different, something like recognition. I walked steadily back to my office at the end of the forgotten hallway, my sanctuary, my bunker, my war room. I closed the door, locked it, and sat at my desk. The plant leaned toward the flickering light above, still trying to live. I opened the cabinet with my key and looked at the archive waiting for me. Years of documents, years of evidence, years of being ignored. I placed the signed notice on the pile. Another artifact, another weapon, another receipt. I powered on my laptop. The cursor blinked on the screen, patient, steady. I was ready. I returned to my office, closing the door quietly behind me. The soft click of the lock sounded like a promise. Outside, the floor hummed with normalcy, colleagues walking past, phones ringing, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Inside, the silence was deliberate. I let it settle around me. It was mine for the moment, a space to think, to breathe, to prepare. The signed disciplinary notice lay on my desk, an artifact of their arrogance. They believed it had broken me. They had no idea. I picked it up and studied it. Every line, every phrase, every carefully crafted word designed to be used against me in the future was now a tool in my hands. The very document that should have marked my defeat would become the key to dismantling their narrative. I opened the drawer containing the archive, my personal library of all the company's past missteps. Each folder was meticulously labeled, indexed, cross-referenced. Employee classifications, overtime records, vendor agreements, compliance memos ignored, warnings dismissed, contracts that promised what could not legally be delivered. Years of evidence, all waiting for the right moment. That moment had come. I began with the emails. Hundreds of messages, each one a record of me flagging issues that were ignored. I compiled them, noting dates, recipients, and responses. Patterns emerged clearly when arranged side by side. A systematic dismissal of concerns, a culture of turning a blind eye, and above all, the hubris of those who believed they could manipulate the system without consequence. Lucas Turner appeared in my thoughts often during this process. His casual smirk, the way he had leaned back in the glass room, sure he had won. He had underestimated the depth of my preparation, the foresight I had exercised in keeping every misstep documented. Every improper promise made to clients, every attempt to bypass compliance, every shortcut intended to secure a deal without regard for legal boundaries, all of it was now part of a growing dossier. I turned my attention to the Singapore contract. Lucas had pushed preliminary versions to the client, containing clauses that were technically violations of international standards. I had corrected them during negotiations, but the original drafts were still in our system, a record of intent. I made a note to include them as evidence. Every detail mattered. The cumulative weight of these actions, properly documented, would be devastating. The hours passed in a rhythm I knew well: analyze, organize, verify, cross-reference. The world outside existed but did not intrude. Coffee cups piled on the desk, notebooks stacked, post-it notes adhered to folders, each labeled with precision. My fingers flew across the keyboard, compiling tables, writing summaries, highlighting dates, and citing statutes. It was not about vengeance. It was about justice, clarity, and the undeniable truth. By late evening, the skeleton of the report had emerged. Sections divided logically: employee misclassification, wage violations, compliance oversights, contract irregularities, and finally, retaliation against me. Each section referenced specific documents, emails, and memos. Every claim was time-stamped. Every dismissal of a warning was noted with the exact language used in responses, often arrogant or dismissive. I paused and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room. The stack of folders beside me was more than evidence. It was a map of the company's failures. It was also a mirror reflecting how I had been perceived all these years: invisible, expendable, underestimated. And yet, I had survived. More than survived. I was ready to reclaim the narrative. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The office was beginning to stir. Employees walked past, some glancing at my door, curious, cautious. I made coffee in the break room, acknowledging a few nods without speaking. No one asked questions. No one could know what was coming. At my desk, I began refining the report. Tables were formatted for clarity, emails reproduced in full, memos scanned and annotated. The disciplinary notice, the very one Lucas and HR believed would mark my surrender, was included prominently as evidence of the company's attempt to manipulate processes against me. I organized everything digitally, creating a master document that told the story clearly, methodically, and irrefutably. I wrote the opening of the report in the first person, a narrative that chronicled my role, my warnings, and the systematic negligence of the leadership. It was clinical, precise, and impossible to dispute. Each section built upon the last, creating a chain of accountability that could not be broken. By afternoon, the report was nearly complete. I reviewed it meticulously, checking every reference, ensuring no detail was overlooked. Every email, memo, and attachment had been cross-checked. Nothing could be dismissed as anecdotal. Nothing could be argued as incomplete. The evidence was exhaustive. I paused to consider the impact. Sending this report would change everything. Careers, reputations, and the company itself were all at stake, but I had anticipated this. I had prepared for it. Every step I had taken over the past 5 years, every warning ignored, every memo dismissed had led to this moment. I created a final folder labeled Distribution, listing recipients strategically, board members, the executive team, legal oversight bodies, and regulatory authorities. The attachments included the full report, supporting documentation, and the disciplinary notice. I included a concise email that stated the facts plainly, with no emotion, no accusation beyond what the evidence proved. I sat back and exhaled. The room was silent, the city outside muted by distance and glass. My phone buzzed with reminders, meetings, and updates. I ignored them all. The task was complete. The stage was set. I allowed myself a brief smile. Lucas, the HR lead, and the corporate lawyer had believed they controlled the narrative. They had underestimated the value of preparation, patience, and meticulous record-keeping. They had also underestimated me. I saved the master file, encrypted and backed up, ready to send. The rest of the evening was spent in quiet reflection, organizing the final details in my mind. The act of sending the report would be decisive, but it would not be reckless. Timing, clarity, and strategy were all part of the execution. By nightfall, I knew that the next day, the company would begin to feel the first tremors. The documents I had compiled would speak louder than any argument, louder than any attempt at manipulation. The narrative of incompetence, negligence, and deliberate wrongdoing was ready to emerge, and I would be the one holding the pen. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the glow of the laptop screen. I leaned back, closed my eyes for a moment, and felt the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. Tomorrow, everything would change. The door to my office closed behind me, and the click of the lock was the only sound that mattered. Outside, the office floor pulsed with normalcy, keyboards tapping, printers whirring, phones ringing. It was the world going on as if nothing had happened. Inside, silence reigned. It was deliberate, sacred, and entirely mine. I set my bag down and opened the cabinet that had been my sanctuary for years. The key turned smoothly, the lock yielding with a quiet, satisfying click. Behind the doors lay the archive, folders meticulously labeled, stacked, and cataloged, each a record of decisions, missteps, and warnings ignored. Every email, every memo, every contract that had ever crossed my desk was here. Years of diligence, patience, and foresight converged in this space. I pulled out the first folder. Its label read, Vendor Compliance, 2018 through 2023. Inside, contracts were stacked chronologically, annotated with notes on clauses that violated policy or law. I leafed through them slowly, deliberately, my eyes scanning each page, tracing the lines of negligence and hubris. Every time a vendor had been given exceptions or allowed to bypass procedure, I had noted it. Each notation was precise, dated, and supported by correspondence. Next, I pulled the Employee Records folder. Misclassified contractors, unpaid overtime, ignored complaints. I sorted the documents in my mind, connecting the dots, revealing the patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. Each file was a node in a network of negligence. Each note a thread pointing directly to accountability. I spread the first few folders across the desk and opened my laptop. The soft hum of the machine was a rhythm I had come to recognize as a companion during long hours of preparation. I began digitizing the most critical documents, scanning, cataloging, cross-referencing. Each document was placed in a folder, each folder linked to another, forming a lattice of evidence that would be impossible to dismantle. The Singapore contract was next. Lucas Turner had pushed preliminary versions to the client, full of clauses that were legally questionable. I had corrected them during negotiation, but the original drafts remained, a record of intent and risk. I annotated each, referencing the emails, internal memos, and approvals that had occurred. I made detailed notes on how each deviation could be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to mislead. Hours passed unnoticed. Coffee cups multiplied on the desk, their heat fading before I touched them. The city outside moved in its constant rhythm, unaware of the storm quietly assembling in my office. I did not look out the window. My focus was internal, the labyrinth of files and data my sole concern. I began compiling the report. Sections were created for each category: vendor misconduct, employee violations, regulatory breaches, contract irregularities, retaliation against compliance staff. Each section included narrative explanations, cross-references, and supporting documentation. The text had to be precise, irrefutable, and logically unassailable. Emotion was unnecessary. Facts carried weight on their own. Lucas's smirk haunted me as I worked. the way he had believed he had orchestrated my downfall. The confidence with which he had leaned back in that glass room, convinced he had won. Every gesture, every word he had used to assert control became a point in my report, demonstrating not only negligence but a willful attempt to manipulate processes for personal gain. I created tables linking dates, actions, and responsible parties. Spreadsheets cross-referenced emails, memos, and meeting notes. Diagrams mapped the flow of responsibility. Each element was a piece of the puzzle, and when assembled, they formed a comprehensive picture of systemic failure and individual culpability. The disciplinary notice I had signed the day before was included prominently. It was proof of the attempt to manipulate me, and now it would serve as evidence of retaliation. I annotated it carefully, noting the date, context, and the calculated timing orchestrated by Lucas and HR. Every word, every gesture, every procedural misstep would be documented and ready for scrutiny. I paused to breathe. The desk before me was a battlefield of paper, a testament to the time, effort, and patience I had invested. Years of preparation had led to this moment. And still, the work had only begun. The report needed narrative coherence, clarity, and authority. It needed to be impossible to dismiss, impossible to ignore, and impossible to attack. I began drafting the opening statement in the first person, weaving my perspective, my experiences, and my observations into a clear, calm narrative. It would chronicle not only my role but the systematic negligence and arrogance of the leadership. Each paragraph was deliberate, each sentence crafted to convey authority without emotion. Facts were my armor. Precision was my weapon. Ours merged. The sun dipped behind the skyline, turning glass towers into dark silhouettes. I did not pause. Every section was built, every reference double-checked. Emails were printed, scanned, annotated. Memos were linked to dates, cross-referenced with meeting notes. Nothing was left ambiguous. Nothing could be dismissed as incidental. By evening, the master report began to take form. Its scale was significant. Hundreds of pages, supporting documents, cross-referenced evidence, charts, and appendices. I reviewed each section, ensuring clarity and accuracy. Every argument built logically, every claim backed by documentation. The report had to speak for itself. I created the distribution list: board members, executives, regulatory authorities, legal oversight bodies. Each recipient was chosen for impact, reach, and accountability. The attachments were organized to maximize clarity and to minimize room for misinterpretation. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the room. My office was quiet, almost reverent. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the storm forming inside my carefully constructed archive. I allowed myself a brief smile, knowing the pieces were in place. The next step would change everything. I powered off the desk lamp, leaving the glow of the laptop as the only light in the room. Tomorrow, the company would begin to feel the tremors. Their arrogance, their miscalculations, their belief that they had trapped me would unravel. The report was ready. The stage was set. Night had fallen, but the office lights glowed like beacons for the work that demanded attention. I sat alone, the city's pulse distant, a soft hum that contrasted sharply with the intensity inside my office. My desk was covered in folders, each one a testament to the negligence, misjudgment, and arrogance of the leadership. Every document was a weapon, waiting to be wielded with precision. I returned to the disciplinary notice I had signed the day before. Lucas had believed it marked my surrender. He had been wrong. I placed it at the top of a stack labeled retaliation evidence. Every detail of the notice was annotated: the date, the time, the context. Every decision by HR, every procedural claim was highlighted, cross-referenced, and linked to emails and internal communications that showed the orchestration behind it. Next, I dove into vendor contracts. Each agreement was cross-checked against compliance protocols and international law. Deviations were documented. Patterns of neglect were mapped. Where exceptions had been granted without proper oversight, I noted the responsible parties and the potential ramifications. I created tables linking dates, actions, and accountability, ensuring that every violation could be traced with clarity. Then I turned to employee records. Misclassifications, unpaid overtime, and dismissed complaints were cataloged meticulously. I noted dates, conversations, and decisions, creating a timeline that showed a consistent pattern of disregard for legal and ethical obligations. Each case added weight to the report, each violation a stone in the edifice of accountability I was building. Contracts from the Singapore deal were next. Lucas had inserted preliminary clauses that violated regulations, pushing them toward the client. I documented the changes I had made, noting approvals, emails, and meeting notes. This created a clear record of both the risk introduced and the corrective actions I had implemented. The narrative of intent versus action would become undeniable. Hours passed in focused silence. Coffee cups multiplied, their heat fading before I touched them. My fingers moved over the keyboard with precision, arranging folders, scanning documents, and annotating where needed. The report began to take shape, each section reinforcing the others. Facts alone formed the backbone of the argument. Narrative was added to clarify context, not to dramatize. I drafted the opening statement in the first person, recounting my experiences, my warnings, and the repeated dismissals I had faced. The language was measured, calm, precise. Emotion was unnecessary. The evidence would speak for itself. I emphasized the systematic negligence of leadership and the deliberate attempts to manipulate procedures to their advantage. As I compiled the appendices, diagrams emerged that mapped responsibilities and actions. Email threads were reproduced in full, highlighting dismissive responses, ignored warnings, and clear instructions overridden. Meeting notes were summarized, showing when discussions had occurred and what decisions had been ignored or reversed. Every claim was documented, time-stamped, and supported by multiple sources. By midnight, the master report was nearly complete. Hundreds of pages of narrative, evidence, and appendices. Tables and charts linked all relevant data. Every statement could be substantiated, every allegation backed by documents. The report had to be irrefutable. Its clarity left no room for obfuscation or denial. I created the distribution list with meticulous care. Board members, executives, regulatory authorities, legal oversight bodies. Each recipient was chosen strategically, ensuring maximum accountability and transparency. Attachments were organized for clarity and impact. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the room. The city outside was quiet, but the storm I had built inside my office was ready to move. Tomorrow, everything would change. The company would begin to feel the impact of their negligence. The document was not just a report, it was a carefully executed plan of accountability. I reviewed the report one last time, checking references, annotations, and cross-links. Every email, memo, and meeting note was present, every procedural violation documented, every act of retaliation noted. Nothing was left to chance. The clock ticked past 1 a.m. I powered down non-essential devices, leaving the laptop ready. The final file was encrypted and backed up, ready to be sent when the time was right. The evidence was complete. The narrative was clear. The company's leadership would not see it coming, not yet. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. Years of meticulous work had led to this point. Years of being underestimated, ignored, and undervalued. All of it had prepared me for this moment. I had built a foundation so solid that the house of cards they relied upon would collapse under its own weight. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the glow of the laptop screen. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the device. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and imagined the next day. The sending of the report would be decisive. It would mark the beginning of accountability, the first ripple in a chain reaction I had set in motion. I took a deep breath, prepared myself mentally for the consequences, and then I allowed the smallest smile to slip across my face. Tomorrow, everything would change. And I would be the one holding the pen. The morning began like any other, but the air felt different, heavier somehow. I arrived at the office, calm on the outside, though inside, a quiet anticipation hummed. The inbox was flooded. Messages from board members, legal oversight, and regulatory agencies appeared like warnings. They had received the report. I had sent it at dawn, carefully timed, with attachments and evidence cataloged to leave no room for misinterpretation. I poured myself coffee, letting the bitter warmth anchor me. Colleagues passed by, eyes flicking toward my office. Some were curious, some wary, others avoided eye contact entirely. Rumors move faster than facts in a company that thinks it can hide behind bureaucracy. Today, the truth was no longer something they could ignore. I opened my laptop and began reviewing responses. Emails from regulatory agencies were brief but pointed. Acknowledgement, request for clarification, and an implicit warning that oversight teams would be involved. I smiled faintly. This was the ripple I had been preparing for, the first tremors. In the hallway, whispers began to swirl. Employees gathered at the edges of doors, catching fragments of conversation. "Did you see the memo?" The board is looking into HR practices. Lucas Turner is under scrutiny. I did not stop to answer or confirm. Silence was a shield. Observation, a weapon. Lucas appeared near the elevator, moving with the same confident stride he always carried. He glanced at me briefly, perhaps expecting a hint of fear or concern. There was none. I met his gaze steadily. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. The first board member meeting called in response to the report was intense. I watched from the periphery as emails circulated, notes were read aloud, and questions sharpened. The leadership team had no script for this. No one could predict the consequences of years of negligence meticulously documented by someone they had underestimated. By mid-morning, HR had called an emergency meeting. They attempted to spin the narrative to minimize the scope of the report. The disciplinary notice I had signed the week before was referenced, the language analyzed, the timing debated. But every argument they tried to construct was countered by the evidence. Emails, memos, scan notes, all corroborated my claims. Employees were whispering in corridors. Some had seen the emails. Some had been copied by mistake. Fear mixed with curiosity. I noticed small groups gathering, quiet conversations punctuated by glances toward my office. They did not know the full extent yet. They would see soon enough. The media had picked up fragments of the story. News alerts arrived on my phone. Headlines hinted at internal disputes, compliance failures, and executive mismanagement. Stock prices began to shift. The ripple had become a wave. The company was beginning to feel the weight of what had been long ignored. Lucas was pacing in his office when I passed by. The earlier confidence in his posture had faltered. He had not anticipated the reach of the report, the precision of the documentation, or the speed with which it spread. I noted his movements, his micro-expressions, cataloging even this for future reference. The day stretched on. Calls from board members, requests for meetings, clarifications, demands for follow-up documents. Each interaction was met with calm efficiency. I provided answers, references, and documentation. No emotion, just facts, methodical and undeniable. By late afternoon, the first executive retreat was convened. The CEO and CFO met behind closed doors. The tension was palpable even from the hall outside. Employees whispered, speculated, and tried to piece together the extent of the unfolding events. No one could predict what would come next. Regulatory oversight teams arrived in small groups. They requested records, clarifications, and historical data. I provided everything they requested, systematically, with cross-references and timestamps. Every answer was precise, every detail verifiable. The cracks in the company's facade were now clearly visible to those with authority. Even Lucas had to participate. I watched from the corner as he struggled to provide coherent explanations. Each attempt he made to deflect responsibility was met with documents I had meticulously prepared. Emails he had sent, approvals he had granted, promises he had made, all were laid bare. He faltered under the scrutiny, and his confidence eroded minute by minute. Employees began to quietly congregate near the HR office, sharing rumors and fragments. Fear was palpable, but so was intrigue. No one had ever seen such a detailed account of executive negligence laid bare so methodically. The whisper network amplified the tension, creating a subtle chaos that could not be contained. By evening, I returned to my office, reviewing the flow of events. Emails from the regulatory teams, board members, and employees filled my inbox. Requests for clarification, additional documentation, and confirmations of procedure came in waves. The report had done its work. The company was trembling, its leadership exposed, its employees unsettled. I sat back in my chair, letting the quiet of the office envelop me. The cracks in the giant were no longer subtle. They were visible, growing, and impossible to ignore. I allowed myself a small smile. Years of preparation, patience, and meticulous record-keeping had led to this moment. The first wave of accountability was underway. I organized follow-up tasks. Any remaining gaps in the documentation, any questions that could be asked by oversight authorities, were preemptively answered and cataloged. I ensured that the narrative I had constructed would remain consistent, coherent, and unassailable. By the end of the day, the company was in a state of controlled chaos. Leadership was scrambling. Employees were uncertain. Regulatory teams were engaged. And I, the quiet observer for so long, was the one orchestrating the unfolding consequences with calm precision. The stage was set for the next phase. The giant had begun to crack, and the tremors would only grow stronger. I knew the path ahead, and I was ready to navigate it with the same patience and precision that had brought me this far. The day after the report went out, the office had transformed. Not physically, but atmospherically. The hum of normal operations carried tension. Conversations were quieter, pauses longer, and every glance seemed loaded with curiosity and apprehension. People had seen the ripple begin and were waiting for the wave. I arrived early, coffee in hand, observing the floor from my office doorway. Small groups whispered in corners. Some employees were sharing fragments of the report they had glimpsed, others speculating about meetings and calls they had overheard. The undercurrent of anxiety was palpable. Rumors moved faster than the official communications. By the time the first board members had convened, the building was already tense. Lucas Turner appeared first. He was moving with the kind of rehearsed casualness that had always been his armor. But today, his armor felt brittle. I watched him cross the lobby and into the executive offices. His pace was measured, controlled, but the slight twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He had underestimated the reach of the report, the clarity of the documentation, and the speed with which it had disseminated. The CEO and CFO called an emergency meeting in the main conference room. I was not invited, but I observed the reactions from the hallway. Their faces were tight, hands fidgeting with pens and papers. The air in the room was heavy with tension. Notes were passed, whispers exchanged, decisions debated. The cracks were widening. HR convened an internal session immediately afterward. Their attempt to spin the narrative was feeble, undermined by the undeniable evidence I had compiled. Every argument was countered by meticulously documented emails, memos, and scanned attachments. They tried to minimize, rationalize, and obfuscate, but the structure of facts I had laid out was impenetrable. Employees were now actively talking in hushed tones, some congregating near offices to exchange information. Curiosity mixed with fear. Some glanced toward my office, sensing that the source of the upheaval was here, methodical, composed, and unshaken. Lucas was called into meetings one after another, forced to respond to questions he had no answers for. His confident facade began to crumble under scrutiny. Every email he had sent, every approval he had granted, every deviation from compliance policies was now under examination. He faltered, misphrased answers, and became increasingly defensive. His smirk faded, replaced by tight lips and restless movements. I observed quietly, cataloging not just documents but behavior. How people reacted, what language they used, the subtle shifts in posture and expression. Even small reactions mattered. They became part of the record. Patterns emerged. The larger the disruption, the clearer the cracks in the company's structure became. By mid-afternoon, the media had caught wind. Short news alerts indicated internal disputes, compliance violations, and executive scrutiny. Employees checked phones, whispered, and adjusted schedules. Stock movement reflected the growing unease. The company was no longer stable, it was shifting under the weight of truth. Board members convened again, demanding clarity, timelines, and accountability. The CEO and CFO had to provide immediate answers. Questions were direct, focused, and relentless. Every misstep, every ignored warning, and every failure to follow procedure was brought to light. The tremors I had initiated were becoming visible cracks. Lucas attempted to regain control, sending emails, calling meetings, trying to clarify points and redirect blame. Each action he took was countered with documents, references, and timelines I had prepared. The report I had meticulously compiled provided a framework that was airtight. His attempts at control only highlighted the failings the report outlined. Employees began to engage more actively with their supervisors, asking questions, clarifying policies, and seeking confirmation on matters that previously went unquestioned. The culture of silence was eroding. Fear was now coupled with awareness. The wheels of accountability had begun turning, and no one could stop them. I spent the afternoon reviewing incoming communications from regulatory bodies. Requests for clarification, supplemental documentation, and verification of procedures arrived in waves. I provided responses systematically, referencing attachments and evidence. The company's leadership had to respond to external oversight, and the cracks became deeper with each exchange. By evening, the full scope of disruption was evident. Leadership meetings were prolonged and tense. Decisions were postponed or reversed. Lucas Turner's confidence was gone. HR was scrambling to maintain credibility. Employees remained watchful, cautious, and increasingly aware of their own stakes. The ripple had become a wave. I returned to my office and sat down, scanning the incoming communications. The numbers of emails, requests, and inquiries were growing. Each was an opportunity to reinforce the evidence, to clarify, to ensure no misrepresentation could occur. The pressure on leadership was mounting, and I was the quiet, deliberate force orchestrating the unfolding accountability. As night fell, the office emptied. Lights dimmed, and the city outside reflected a soft orange glow. I powered down non-essential devices, leaving only my laptop active. I reviewed the report, the appendices, and the distribution log one more time. Every reference was accounted for, every cross-link verified, every document backed up and encrypted. I leaned back, allowing the quiet to fill the room. The first visible cracks had appeared, and the tremors would continue to spread. The company could no longer ignore the depth of systemic failure. Every decision, every misstep, every deliberate oversight I had documented now bore fruit. Tomorrow, the company would begin to face external scrutiny more directly. Internal panic would grow. Employees would continue to whisper, leadership would continue to falter, and the company's foundations would be tested like never before. I allowed a small, satisfied smile. The giant was cracking, and the wave I had set in motion was unstoppable. The day began with the kind of stillness that carries weight. The city outside was moving, but inside the office, tension had thickened the air. I arrived early, coffee in hand, observing the subtle shifts in the environment. Employees moved cautiously, conversations hushed, eyes darting toward doors and screens. Whispers circulated faster than emails. Everyone had seen fragments of the fallout. The first wave hit when the CEO was summoned for an emergency review by the board. He emerged briefly to greet a few staff members with a calm facade, but the subtle twitch of his jaw betrayed stress. In the meeting, questions were pointed, unrelenting, focused on accountability. Every misstep, every ignored warning, every bypassed procedure referenced in my report was now under scrutiny. Lucas Turner was called into multiple meetings throughout the morning. His confident posture had faded. Emails he had sent, decisions he had signed, deviations from compliance policy, all were examined with precise attention. His voice faltered, his arguments weak, as documents I had meticulously collected were presented against him. Every attempt to redirect blame only highlighted the gaps in his judgment and the consequences of his actions. HR attempted damage control, circulating memos and clarifications, but their credibility was eroding. Every statement was countered with evidence I had supplied, pointing out discrepancies and past oversights. Employees began to question previously accepted practices, and informal discussions revealed growing distrust. The media had picked up the story more aggressively. Headlines hinted at internal chaos, compliance violations, and executive scrutiny. News alerts flashed on personal devices, creating ripples of anxiety throughout the workforce. Stock prices fluctuated, reflecting the perceived instability. The tremors I had set in motion were now visible externally. By mid-morning, I convened my own review, checking responses from regulatory authorities. Requests for additional documentation and clarifications arrived in a steady stream. I provided each with precision and verification, ensuring that no misstatement or omission could be used against me or the evidence. Each response reinforced the narrative of accountability and transparency. Lucas's attempts to regain composure were visible. He called meetings, drafted emails, and requested clarifications, but each action was countered by the evidence I had compiled. His movements became hurried, his voice sharper, his gestures more abrupt. For the first time, he appeared uncertain. He had relied on the assumption that his position and charm could deflect scrutiny. That assumption was dissolving. Board members began requesting detailed briefings, scrutinizing processes, decisions, and past communications. The CEO and CFO struggled to provide coherent explanations. Their confidence eroded under the weight of documented evidence. Emails were forwarded to them, memos referenced, and meetings replayed in full. The cracks within the leadership were widening. By noon, employees were visibly affected. Conversations at desks were hushed but intense. People shared information cautiously, aware that oversight bodies were now actively engaged. The culture of silence had begun to break, replaced by observation, questioning, and anxiety. The company's internal equilibrium was destabilized. Lucas was called again, this time into a review with external auditors and regulatory representatives. The process was meticulous. Every document, every email, every approval sequence was examined. Questions were direct and precise. His answers were incomplete, inconsistent, and increasingly defensive. The facade of control he had maintained for years was collapsing. The HR team attempted another internal session to stabilize morale. They distributed memos, held brief meetings, and tried to explain processes. But employees, armed with fragments of the report and the knowledge that senior leadership was under scrutiny, were skeptical. The sense of stability had evaporated. Fear was now coupled with awareness, creating an environment ripe for accountability. By mid-afternoon, regulatory oversight had expanded. Requests for clarification intensified. Each new inquiry required careful response, cross-referenced with evidence I had meticulously compiled. The chain of responsibility became clearer with each interaction. Leadership could not escape examination. The tremors had turned into waves. I spent the afternoon reviewing incoming communications. Every question, request, or clarification from board members and oversight teams was answered systematically. My responses were precise, documented, and verified. Each reply reinforced the report, each clarification highlighted the depth of negligence, and each step increased the pressure on leadership. By evening, the effects were undeniable. Leadership meetings were tense, prolonged, and reactive. Executives were exhausted, defensive, and visibly shaken. Employees were observant, cautious, and increasingly aware of their own stakes. Lucas's confidence was gone, replaced by stress and uncertainty. HR's credibility was faltering. The company's internal structure was straining under the weight of evidence I had prepared. I leaned back in my office chair, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the stream of incoming communications. The cracks were no longer subtle. Tremors had evolved into visible breaks in the foundation. The company, once stable in its arrogance, was now vulnerable, exposed, and accountable. The first phase of reckoning had begun. The narrative I had constructed through meticulous documentation and strategic dissemination of evidence was unfolding exactly as planned. The giant had begun to crumble. Tomorrow would bring deeper scrutiny, and the external forces engaged now would amplify the internal fractures. Employees would continue to observe and react. Leadership would struggle to maintain control. Lucas Turner and his cohorts would face consequences they had never anticipated. I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction. Years of preparation, patience, and foresight had culminated in this moment. The company could no longer dismiss negligence, retaliation, or failures in compliance. The wave had been set in motion, and it would not subside. The morning arrived with the kind of tension that makes air feel heavy. Employees moved cautiously through corridors, eyes shifting toward offices and screens. Rumors had spread like wildfire, and the fragments they carried were enough to unsettle the floor. Whispers carried hints of oversight meetings, regulatory scrutiny, and internal investigations. The board convened early, demanding explanations, documentation, and accountability. The CEO and CFO were called first. Questions were direct, precise, and relentless. Every deviation, oversight, and failure documented in my report was brought to the forefront. Their calm facades wavered, and for the first time, the weight of consequence was undeniable. Lucas Turner was summoned soon after. The smirk he had worn for so long was gone. Confidence had given way to tension, subtle but visible. Every email he had sent, every approval he had signed, every shortcut he had taken was under the microscope. The auditors referenced specific dates, times, and communications, tying actions directly to regulatory violations and potential legal consequences. Then came the twist, the revelation that would redefine everything. As I had anticipated, some of Lucas's maneuvers extended beyond negligence. Evidence surfaced that he had deliberately siphoned funds through offshore vendors, coordinated with external partners to manipulate outcomes, and engaged in international compliance violations. Every action was documented, time-stamped, and corroborated by internal and external communications. The room was silent. The board's expressions shifted from curiosity to shock. The CEO's hand trembled slightly as he held a report highlighting Lucas's activities. The CFO's eyes widened. Even HR, who had orchestrated the disciplinary measures against me, could not mask their astonishment. Lucas sat frozen, every attempt at explanation faltering under the weight of undeniable evidence. Regulatory authorities had already been notified of suspicious activity. The auditors cross-referenced financial records, contracts, and email trails. The patterns were consistent, deliberate, and criminally negligent. Lucas Turner, who had believed himself untouchable, had been ensnared by the very systems he tried to manipulate. Employees, now aware of the unfolding drama, whispered nervously. Confidence in leadership was eroding rapidly. The company, once a towering giant, showed signs of instability at every level. Questions about oversight, accountability, and trust spread through the ranks like wildfire. The CEO attempted to regain control, calling for immediate explanations and corrective measures. But the documents spoke louder than words. Every move Lucas had made was meticulously recorded. Every deviation from procedure and law was laid bare. He could no longer deflect, delay, or manipulate. The board and auditors were relentless. By mid-afternoon, Lucas was placed on administrative leave, pending formal investigation. The legal implications were severe: potential criminal charges, financial penalties, and professional disbarment from executive positions. The leadership team scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency meetings, damage control communications, and strategy sessions dominated the rest of the day. The employees, witnessing the unraveling of power structures, began questioning past decisions and future directives. Morale shifted, not in despair but in cautious vigilance. The culture of silence had been broken. The systems of accountability were now visible, and everyone understood the implications. Regulatory authorities continued to engage directly, requesting clarifications, interviews, and document verification. I responded systematically, providing evidence, references, and cross-references. Each response reinforced the narrative of accountability, emphasizing transparency and integrity. By evening, the scale of the disruption was evident. Leadership was exhausted, anxious, and reactive. Lucas's career, built on manipulation and deception, had begun to collapse spectacularly. HR struggled to maintain credibility, their prior actions now scrutinized in a new light. The CEO and CFO faced direct questioning on decisions they had previously ignored or rationalized. From my office, I observed the network of reactions, the shifts in posture, the subtle tremors of panic and disbelief. The report had not only exposed the misdeeds, but had triggered a cascade of consequences that would continue to unfold. I reviewed communications once more. Incoming inquiries, clarifications, and requests for additional documentation were handled with precision. Every interaction further validated the report, further reinforced accountability, and increased the pressure on the leadership team. By nightfall, the first round of reckoning had concluded. Lucas Turner was publicly implicated. Regulatory agencies were actively engaged. Board members had demanded immediate action, and internal trust had been irrevocably shaken. I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. Years of preparation, patience, and foresight had culminated in this moment. The giant had cracked, and the wave I had set in motion had struck its target. Tomorrow would only deepen the consequences, but for now, the first tremors had proven the precision and effectiveness of the work I had done. The stage was set for complete accountability. The ripple of evidence had become a wave, and I, the quiet observer for so long, had orchestrated it all with calm precision, patience, and undeniable proof. The first morning after the dust had settled felt almost surreal. The city outside moved in its usual rhythm, taxis weaving, sirens rising and falling, pedestrians moving with a purpose. Inside my apartment, however, silence prevailed. I brewed coffee slowly, savoring its warmth and aroma, letting the reality of the past days settle over me. The wave I had sent rippling through the company was now far-reaching. The tremors of accountability had been felt. Lucas Turner had been suspended. Internal investigations had escalated, and regulatory authorities were fully engaged. The leadership team scrambled to respond, their decisions scrutinized, their actions cross-referenced against the evidence I had compiled. Employees whispered cautiously in corridors, processing what had happened. The company, once a towering presence of confidence and authority, was visibly shaken. I opened my laptop, reviewing the messages from oversight bodies and board members. Requests for clarification and supplemental documentation had been answered systematically, but the effects were cumulative. Each response I had provided, each piece of evidence I had submitted, had built a chain that was undeniable. The patterns of negligence and misconduct were now plain, documented, and undeniable. Yet, in the midst of this upheaval, I found a quiet satisfaction. Not in the chaos, but in the precision of what had been achieved. Years of preparation, careful documentation, and strategic patience had led to this point. The company could no longer ignore negligence, mismanagement, or retaliation. Every misstep, every attempt to manipulate processes had been exposed, cataloged, and validated. As I scrolled through emails, I allowed myself a brief reflection. The Singapore deal had survived. Internal accountability was underway. The disciplinary notices, once intended to undermine me, had been transformed into evidence of manipulation. I had orchestrated the outcome without emotion, without haste, relying on evidence and meticulous preparation. The office phone rang softly. It was an unexpected call from the executive search team of a multinational organization in Europe. They had heard about the events, about the precision, the calm, and the methodical handling of complex crises. They wanted to discuss a role, Chief Compliance Officer, a position that would put me at the helm of policy, oversight, and strategic compliance for an entire enterprise. I listened carefully, asking questions, gathering information. The terms, the expectations, and the resources available were substantial. It was an opportunity not only to step into a leadership role I had earned, but also to shape the culture and integrity of a new organization. I accepted their invitation for a formal discussion, aware that this path would take me far from familiar streets, colleagues, and offices. Back in my apartment, I allowed myself a moment of calm reflection. The city hummed below, unaware of the precise orchestration that had unfolded within the walls of my former workplace. I sipped coffee slowly, thinking of the lessons learned: patience, observation, documentation, and strategic action. These had been my allies. They had allowed me to survive, to act, and ultimately to control the narrative. By mid-morning, messages from colleagues began arriving. Some expressed cautious congratulations, others awe, a few thinly veiled resentment. The workplace culture had shifted. Those who had underestimated me now realized the depth of preparation, foresight, and resilience required to navigate such challenges successfully. I reviewed my personal notes and records. The files, emails, and memos were still there, cataloged and secure. They were a map of the past months, a record of actions taken, and a reference for the future. The responsibility they represented was heavy, but it also reinforced the importance of careful, precise action. As the day progressed, I packed essential documents, prepared travel arrangements, and began organizing a transition plan. The role in Europe would require focus, dedication, and strategic planning. I reviewed potential scenarios, anticipated challenges, and considered the organizational structures I might encounter. Every contingency had been accounted for, every strategy considered. The evening brought quiet contemplation. I looked out the window, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. The past weeks had been a crucible, testing patience, judgment, and resolve. I had emerged not only intact but stronger, prepared for a role that demanded oversight, clarity, and ethical precision. I drafted a brief message to a select few trusted colleagues. Keep your records, document everything. One day, your diligence may be your greatest protection. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. I had lived them, acted upon them, and now shared them as guidance. By nightfall, the office was quiet, and the city outside settled into a muted glow. I reviewed the final emails for the day, confirming that the processes I had put in motion were continuing to take effect. The company, shaken, was adjusting to the new reality. Leadership accountability had begun. Employees were alert, cautious, and reflective. I allowed myself a final glance at the city skyline. The horizon was clear, promising, and full of potential. The next chapter awaited: a role with authority, influence, and the ability to enforce ethical and compliance standards at the highest levels. And for the first time in years, I felt the quiet satisfaction of alignment between skill, action, and purpose. The flight to Europe was quiet. I had a window seat, a notebook open, and a carefully organized list of priorities. The clouds below looked like rivers of silver, flowing endlessly toward horizons I had not yet seen. I reviewed the documentation, the transition plans, and the initial framework for my new role. Every step, every detail had been anticipated. Landing in the new city, I was met by the executive search team. Their offices overlooked a river that gleamed in the morning sun. The energy was different here, purposeful, disciplined, and open to innovation. The Chief Compliance Officer role was expansive. I would be responsible for setting policy, ensuring accountability, and shaping culture. The weight of the position was substantial, but so was the opportunity. I walked through the office, observing staff, meeting team leads, and noting processes. The organization had structure, but there were gaps in enforcement, oversight, and clarity. My first days would be spent building bridges between policy and practice, aligning compliance standards, and instilling transparency. The lessons from my previous company would guide me: documentation, patience, and strategic foresight. By mid-afternoon, I had held initial briefings with department heads. I outlined priorities, emphasized accountability, and explained the importance of clear communication. My approach was firm but measured, encouraging questions, collaboration, and initiative. I noted reactions carefully: attentive, receptive, curious, some cautious. The seeds of influence were planted. Emails arrived from the home office, colleagues sending congratulations, observations, and even cautionary advice. I responded succinctly, acknowledging receipt, confirming priorities, and maintaining focus on immediate responsibilities. The past could be reflected upon later. The present demanded attention. In the evening, I walked along the river. The city lights reflected in the water, fragmented, beautiful, and dynamic. I thought of the path I had taken: the battles in boardrooms, the meticulous collection of evidence, the exposure of negligence, and the strategic execution of accountability. Every choice, every calculation, every risk had led to this moment. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a brief note: keep your records, document everything. One day, diligence is your greatest protection. These were not abstract words. They were the core of my philosophy, born of experience and necessity. The following days were intense. Meetings, briefings, strategy sessions, and document reviews filled each hour. I navigated complex organizational hierarchies, introduced new compliance procedures, and ensured that processes were clear, enforceable, and transparent. Every document, every memo, every report was cataloged, referenced, and archived. My system was ready to prevent the oversights and negligence I had witnessed previously. News from the previous company reached me slowly. Leadership had begun restructuring. Lucas Turner's career had effectively ended, the board was implementing oversight measures, and HR was under scrutiny. Employees whispered of change, of the woman who had meticulously documented, executed, and redefined accountability. My presence in Europe was remote, but my influence lingered. I began mentoring my new team, emphasizing principles of clarity, evidence-based decision-making, and accountability. I encouraged meticulous documentation and transparency. The culture I intended to build was one where neglect would be noticed, where processes were followed, and where ethical standards were not negotiable. Evenings were quiet but filled with reflection. I reviewed the past weeks, analyzing decisions, actions, and outcomes. I noted patterns, refined strategies, and considered potential challenges. Every lesson learned was cataloged, every insight preserved. My experiences had become a blueprint for leadership, strategy, and ethical oversight. As the week drew to a close, I stood by the office window, looking over the city. The lights shimmered like stars reflected in water, distant yet vivid. I thought of the journey, from meticulous planning, navigating internal treachery, exposing negligence, and orchestrating accountability. Each moment, each decision had prepared me for this chapter. I drafted a short email to a few trusted colleagues back home: congratulations, guidance, and encouragement. Keep your records, document everything. The lessons were universal. Transparency and diligence were not just tools, they were shields, weapons, and guides. That evening, I allowed myself a quiet celebration. Not of victories over individuals, but of mastery, preparation, and the capacity to shape outcomes through strategic foresight. I had survived, acted decisively, and emerged with the authority to influence systems at a high level. Looking out over the river, the city reflecting in fractured light, I felt a sense of alignment I had rarely experienced. Skill, patience, and action had converged. Responsibility, foresight, and clarity had been validated. And ahead lay the vast expanse of possibilities: a new organization, new challenges, and a landscape where integrity and strategic execution would guide every decision. I closed my notebook, powered down my devices, and allowed the silence to wash over me. The city moved below, unaware of the meticulous orchestration that had unfolded. I stood in quiet reflection, ready for the next steps, confident in my capabilities, and prepared for the responsibilities of the role I had earned. Tomorrow, the work would continue. But tonight, I was aligned with purpose, prepared to influence, and equipped with the experience, knowledge, and clarity to lead with integrity. The other side had been reached, and it was only the beginning.